Hopefully everyone can see this okay. Today I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the generic query in terms of how it relates to some of the data visualization exercises that we've done in class before. So I know a lot of you have taken the data visualization course, and we have previously done it using version 6. More recently, last week, I know a few of you with me for the version 10 course, and we did see some differences in how we would use and generate the generic query going from version 6 to 10. So just to give you some scope of what I'm going to talk about, this is in the context of the data visualization and the exercises you would have encountered had you taken the course through CloseReach. Okay, so we're really talking about those differences that we had to implement in order to execute those exercises. So what were the differences in QualiWare 10 versus what we had to do in QualiWare 6? Okay. If you haven't worked with the generic query before, I don't know if many of you have or haven't, but just a quick definition. The generic query templates or object in QualiWare, it's used to provide data sets that can then be used by other templates in QualiWare. So you may have used a query designer in the past to create the generic query to use in your report definition template. For the data visualization course, we use the generic query so we can read data to create business charts and to also create performance indicators. So those two templates are dependent on the generic query in order to read data. Okay. Okay. In our data visualization course, we do not use, we don't like automatically create a generic query by using the query designer or anything like that. We use data that we preset in Excel spreadsheets. Okay, so much like if you were grabbing data from another external source or some sort of database. In our exercises, we structure that around data that exists in Excel spreadsheets. Okay, so those are our data sources that we want to create a generic query with. And the first thing we have to do when we have this sort of external data source and we're not using the query designer is that we need to create that data source connection object first. So creating this data source connection object, this is the first time that we noticed that there was a difference in how we would utilize the object in order to execute our exercise. And then also when we were creating the generic query itself, it also resulted in some modifications in the steps that we used, and so maybe some of the steps that you would see in the future if you were using version 10. Okay. So on the left-hand side of the screen, I have a screenshot of version 6. This is the data source connection object in version 6. And on the right hand, we have the data source connection object in version 10. So our primary difference here is in that very first dialog, I don't have a screenshot of it, but in the very first dialog in our data source connection dialog, nothing had really changed. We were still using a driver and choosing the appropriate driver for whatever format our data was in. In this case, it would be the Excel driver that we were choosing. So that was fine. But when we got to the catalog dialog, this is where we had to make a change. Previously, we were using the ODBC driver to grab that information, and that worked fine. When we went to the test connection, we could see our different sheets and different headings in the table. There is the option of the QIS server driver in version 6 as well, but when we chose that, we wouldn't be our connection. When we tested it, it wouldn't work. So using the ODBC driver is how we executed these Excel-based exercises in the past. Moving on to version 10, we needed to use the QIS server driver. Okay, and then when we chose that, that was the only way that we were able to test that connection and see that that connection was working. Okay, so that would be a difference worth noting if you've taken the course in the past and you want to try some of these things again in version 10. Okay. So once we got that working, so the test connection was working, then we were fine to go and we could go ahead and create that generic query object. So in version 6, what we will notice is when you create a new instance of the generic query, you're presented with this empty table. So it kind of looks like that little screenshot right on the left-hand side here, where you just get these empty cells. And then you would have to go ahead and double click on the top left cell to access the object editor for the generic query. So once you got into the object editor, on that very first tab called generic query, the very first dialog, you'd go ahead and choose your data source connection, so that's fine. You'd select what sheet. In our case, we had multiple sheets on an Excel workbook, for example, so we'd want to specify what sheet of information we were looking at. And then we would also choose to build this result matrix and choose to execute it only at client side. And that would work. That would work fine. So we were able to read things from the catalog. A weird bug that always happened is you'd get to your last column of data, it would repeat. So you'd see it says year output and then output again. So that would repeat. It was just kind of, I don't know, just kind of a bug in QualiWare. It always happened like that in version 6, and then you'd have to go ahead and delete that entry, or else your resulting generic query matrix would have 2 columns of the same data. Okay, so when you go ahead and delete that second output, you'd get that single column. But what you're left with is a pretty stable, static generic query, like a matrix type of presentation of your information. If your source data or your Excel spreadsheet changed later on, you would have to come back in and go rebuild to create another, to update this table, if you will, or this generic query. Okay, so this is actually quite different in version 10, because in version 10, when you create a new instance of the generic query, you're not presented with this empty table. It just opens up the object editor immediately. And even the object editor, just the size and the positionings of some of the options, the fields are different, okay? The other thing that's weird is that you do have to manually add your square brackets around your sheet selection. And I think that's probably the most problematic, because it's not very intuitive to always think you have to do that. Whereas in version 6, under the table selection drop-down box, you would just choose it from the drop-down box, and those square brackets were already in there. And in version 10, you'd have to just make sure that you do go back and add those square brackets around whatever your sheet selection is from your Excel workbook. Okay. Other main differences, that we're using dynamic execution for the business chart. So if I go back to my version 6, I was using result matrix and only a client side. That doesn't work with the settings now in version 10. In order to implement the exercises that we have. So we need to now we don't actually have to choose dynamic execution, that's the default value, so you just leave it as is. And then you generate a preview of the generic query. So it'll show you the data in a tabular format, but you're not actually like building it. It's not something static that you're gonna come back to every time you open up your generic query. It's not gonna pop up on your screen. You're always gonna have to view that preview of it. Okay, you also need to get your default values in your attribute definition dialog, and you're going to notice that rebuild option is no longer available because now it's replaced with a preview button, and there's also no matrix behavior dialog available. Okay, so this is what it would look like. This is the generic query here. So you'll see in the bigger screenshot at the top here, it's a lot longer than, like visually it's longer than the version 6 one, but it does have the same the same data available. The main differences here is that choosing dynamic execution, I have to absolutely make sure that I manually add these square brackets in here, which I think is maybe just a bit of an oversight. So I have reported that because I think that should just be part of your dropdown. And also when you choose you get your values from the catalog, you won't get that redundancy. So that's actually an improvement, that you won't get that redundancy of the last column. Okay, but what you will notice is other thing you have to do is in the attribute definition field, you have to go get those populated. But when you hit preview, you will see this pop up. It's the filter designer, and it'll show you just a preview of your data what your data is. But it's dynamic, so you're not actually building that generic query. Every time you are using this query, it's going to, from the back end, execute it again. So if there are changes to your data source, it's going to pull in those changes. Now, if you don't want to do that because it can take a little bit more processing time, what I've done is I've just clicked on my enabling of the cache, and that way I'm pulling up that historical or whatever the last time I previewed my data was. Okay, but if you don't, then you're always generating that new data. Okay. So those were the main differences. After that, once we got into actually creating our data visualization objects, whether they were performance indicators or business charts, they operated in exactly the same way. Okay, so we probably don't use a generic query as much as many of you do out in the field there. So I just wanted to ask if any of you have experienced many differences while using the generic query in QualiWare X that you wanted to share.
Well, I raised my hand, but I don't know whether you're watching for that. I didn't want to trap over anybody. I've also noticed that when you, we used to use generic queries also to publish instead of a QRV, and the generic queries don't publish in a grid anymore. They seem to have, the publishing template seems to have dropped the grid, and it only shows the pivot table, so counts on a pivot table. I don't know if you guys have any comment on that.
I don't, but if anyone wants to take the floor, I don't know if anyone's worked with.
I've seen it as well.
Yeah.
And had, to be honest, no concerns. If I try and remember the template that I put the query design into, so that way it did publish in QEP, but I can get that for you. But I'm very happy with the query design, much improved versus 6.
Yeah, if you could share with us, that's Barry or James over at CBSA, that would be great, because we use it instead of QRVs in some cases because of the link values are a lot easier to configure using the generic queries. And so that's problematic for us that all of a sudden it doesn't show in a grid anymore.
All right, Barry.
Thanks, JR.
Can I throw in a quick caution about the generic queries on the web front end that we saw at D&D? We noticed that if your user doesn't have a person object in the repository and they have a read-only license, they will not be able to view the generic query data. So this is something we saw in version 6.6 using generic queries, and so we ended up we've been updating all of ours to QRVs because they don't require that person object in the repository.
Interesting. We never had the same problem. It's funny, you were going one way or we were going the other.
Shanthi, this is Christine. I had the problem like you said, like with the version 6.6, it's the generic query with the last duplicated item, this thing. So if you miss that part, so you move to the next part, you think you get catalog, you got the field already, you just didn't see that it's duplicate because 6.6.10, I didn't see this.
Yeah,
and if you have that thing, your chart wizard wouldn't work anymore. So you're not able to launch so basically if you did not manually remove it and moving to the next, you're blocked. So
yeah, that's something
it's pretty
definitely to
bad
watch
bug.
for.
Yeah.
Yeah, to watch for. Yeah, it is a bug. It's been there for as long as I've seen it. But luckily that's improved in version 10. Okay, Cecile, maybe back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shanthi.